Hi, everyone. My name is Laura Strine. I'm the team leader for Repowering America's Land Initiative at EPA. I'm here today with Nate Blair and Bill Tokash from the National Renewable Energy Lab. The EPA and the National Renewable Energy Lab partner to support stakeholder engagement around renewable energy projects that are sited on contaminated lands. Nate Blair is NREL's tool developer, and Bill Tokash is NREL's Repowering America's Land Initiative lead. We're very excited to have them here to talk about project development tools today. I will turn it over to Bill Tokash. Thank you.
So what we'll talk about today is a little bit of an introduction to what the repowering team can bring to project development needs at redevelopment sites. We'll touch on the typical project deployment scenarios, how renewable energy projects come together at our sites. We'll highlight an overview of project development steps and how we can best support early stage development of potential opportunities. We'll highlight then which of these tools that we have are best equipped to support some of these development stages. We'll go through a little bit of an overview on the tools, what they are, and why you might use one, what the outcomes will be, and then we'll have a closing discussion. So the repowering team can support project development in 3 ways. Summarizing how repowering projects on the renewable energy side are typically deployed, highlighting the tools that can support early stage development, and then describing the outputs from these different tools and how they might support the needs to move projects forward into development. So on the right-hand side here, we have a summary of the normal steps in project development activities from pre-screening and site selection down through construction and commissioning, performance, and decommissioning even. And the tools that we have and the support that we have are best applied early on to get the ball rolling in project development. So pre-screening analysis and site selection is when you're trying to actually figure out if the site's worth pursuing or looking at. And then there are different degrees of feasibility analysis, how much work is done to see if you have a project that may be viable relative to the deployment model in question. And so our tool support focuses on those stages. We'll talk more about that in a moment. But first off, there are a lot of different ways that renewable energy projects come together, but there's really primarily 3 models that are going to be deployed at these sites. The first one is the site operator owned model. And so this is a project where the renewable energy system will be located behind the utility meter of the site operator, who's being provided electrical service by the utility. And that system will operate in parallel to the site load and the utility grid. The primary focus there is often to reduce energy costs, and there may or may not be financing under a third-party ownership model by the site operator. The second category is utility-owned. So that's where the utility will own the project. They may get to that ownership through a variety of pathways, but they're going to own the project or the output from the project, either supply their own electricity customers or under a community solar tariff. And then the third model is in retail choice electricity states. So there are a number of states, as you're aware, where a site operator can buy electricity from someone other than the local utility that's providing the meter. And in that case, there is a model where a developer and/or an energy supplier in those states will develop, design, finance, build, own, and operate the project and sell that output to their customers. So for site operator-owned projects, the primary support stages for us are at the pre-screening, site selection, and feasibility analysis stage. And so you can see here in the middle column, we've mapped each of the tools that we have and the outcome from the application of those tools. And we can discuss for a moment here how that supports early stage project development. So the repowering mapper tool, of course, is useful for initial site identification. We have outlined in here some system sizing benchmarks. You can apply these benchmarks to determine how many kilowatts of DC solar may be available to be constructed as an initial step on a per acre basis of available land. We'll talk about PVWatts. So PVWatts is useful to determine what the output is annually in kilowatt hours, which may be important for the eligibility for certain incentives like net metering from the local utility, sizing the system to load, initial screening from that standpoint. REopt is a tool that NREL has that can be applied to determine the business case based on the load, the tariff, and the cost of on-site energy at a high level. Nate will talk a little bit more about that tool in a moment. And then System Advisor model is a model that's primarily focused on determining the cost to produce energy. It might be more applicable on a utility-owned or supplier-owned model and can support financing options as well. But those are the primary tools that we have to support site operator-owned projects. For utility and supplier developer-owned projects, got a footnote here that highlights that generally, when you look at utilities and or developers and suppliers who have more experience developing these projects for their customers, they're typically going to be bringing their own analysis tools to the table, similar to what we have with REopt and or System Advisor module. They use publicly or commercially available products called PVSys or Aurora or others. So our best role here on these types of discussions is not to try to recreate the work that those utilities and supplier developers may do, but just to try to highlight some of the early stage steps that we just touched on, like site identification, system sizing, benchmarks, and initial screening, just to get the ball rolling and sort of tee up the discussion for those other stakeholders once they come to the table. And then I'll talk a little bit now, moving into some of the tools. I'll talk about the repowering mapper, and then I'll turn it over to Nate in a moment. So as many of you are well aware, the repowering mapper tool is an interactive website that identifies contaminated lands, landfills, mine sites for initial discussions. So we've got over 190,000 sites pre-screened for renewable energy potential to support these early steps. And it's important to note that while certainly certain parts of the country have more solar intensity than others geographically, that the dramatic decline over time in system costs has made solar potentially viable in many places in the U.S. So the approach there is that we certainly have tutorials that can be leveraged by you all and also by the stakeholders to find these sites and see if they might be close to where the ownership is and where the projects are located. And it's a great first step for identifying potential sites for pre-screening. So I'll pause there and then turn over to Nate for a discussion of some of the tools here. And Nate, if you'd like, I can drive and just tell me when to click. So.
Sure. Thank you, Bill. Excited to be here today, talk about some of my favorite tools. Before we go into that, I think one of the tricky pieces in all of this modeling is saying roughly like, hey, I've got this chunk of land. How many megawatts could I roughly fit on that? And that's an evolving question as technology changes. But we've got a rule of thumb here that we would walk through. And I think this is a good starting point. And obviously, a developer will take a bunch of additional measurements to really fine tune how something would lay out on a piece of land. But basically, you take the acres available either from Mapper or from Google Maps or from other sources, take about 73% of that land. And that's kind of our average. That's how much can actually go towards PV power. The rest goes towards roads, ancillary needs typically, and then multiply that by 4.2 acres per megawatt. for a single axis tracker, or something closer to 5 acres per megawatt for other options. But let's stick with this 4.2 acres per megawatt. That gives you an idea of how many megawatts you could fit, and then from there we can work our way through, like, what does that produce, what might that cost, etc. So next slide. So, and the next step is the easiest next step is a straightforward tool that we offer called PVWatts. And it calculates the amount of output from a PV system. And let's go to the next slide. Give you an idea of the inputs, but it's pretty easy. You just put in the location. It can go from an address to a city. It then uses that to pick the best weather file for that location. Then you put in this size in kilowatts here that we just talked about. What kind of array is it? Single axis tracking is a very typical array for a utility scale system. We can also do roof mounting, etc. System losses, and then tilt and azimuth are just the orientation. And each of those little eyes indicate a spot where you can get more information, answer your questions. And then next slide. It produces the total number of kilowatt hours per year for a typical year. Looks at it both annually there at the top and then by month, and gives you a little bit of an idea in the light gray text of the uncertainty around that. Every year will be slightly different. But this will be the typical year based on the last 20 years that we've had. Next slide. So that's probably our simplest tool. It does one thing, it does it really well. A lot of organizations and some subsidy providers use PVWatts. Move on to another tool called REopt, which does sort of 2 or 3 key things. One of which is you put in how much load you have for your facility. That could be one building, it could be a bunch of buildings all together. You put in, oh geez, if the power goes out, we want to be able to maintain power. So there's some resiliency aspects to this tool. And you put in the rate that facility is under. So these are primarily behind the meter systems. And we'll get to what to do if you're selling power directly to the utility in a minute. But these are behind the meter systems. And what it does once you click go is picks the appropriate size of PV that's optimal. If you have really low utility rates, it might pick a size of PV that's 0. If you have really, really high utility rates, it might pick a PV and battery size just for the economics. And then if you have, as I said, resiliency issues or other things that you need to meet, it will make a mix of things. It has a lot of different technologies in it. PV, batteries, wind, ground source heat pumps, etc. So it's quite a powerful tool, but still has a fairly straightforward web interface and a lot of defaults that you can use both for rates and loads and so forth. Next slide. Then the other tool that I'll touch on is a more complex tool. Takes more effort to get up to speed on. It does on the left-hand side here, very similar to what we were just talking about with PVWatts, particularly if it's just a PV system. The SAM model does do all that same sort of calculations, allows you to pick different actual panels. Oh, I want a SunPower panel, or I want a Tesla panel, or I want a Tesla battery, or some of these other options. You can pick some of those units specifically, but then it adds on this whole second piece, which is a cash flow model, a detailed financial model into which you put costs and incentives and financing and how you're getting paid for it. And you put all of that together and you end up with a bunch of really interesting sort of high-level financial outputs, including the net present value, the levelized cost of energy, the payback period, what kind of PPA you would need from the utility to make this project work financially. So all of those things can be outputs from this model. And I would just add, it's not quite as daunting as it sounds because we have default values for the costs, defaults for the incentives, financing, etc. And then you can change all of those inputs as you get more deeper into this. But from a first pass feasibility perspective, a lot of those default inputs are appropriate. Next slide, please. With that, I will pass it back to Bill for the closing.
Sure. So just to recap what we've covered here. So as you're aware, we're committed to supporting stakeholders' early stage project development as requested. We've summarized here how successful projects are typically deployed. And then we've had a discussion about the data and tools that can support these early stage project development needs.